Welcome back to the Wandering Naturalist podcast of Three Rivers. I'm Angela, she, her.
And I'm Brandon, he, him.
Last time we talked to Dr. DeAndre Smiles about Paul Bunyan. I'm so excited we finally got to share that. We'll have to share the presentation because I really hope people take that as an easy catalyst for bringing more information to that story, like two sides to it. I have more than two sides to it, but...
I think just having the complete story. I always like having the complete story of something because it helps me understand it better.
Yeah. And for me, it made me, again, realize, too, like the destruction of timber harvest and the relationship to the land and what that did to indigenous cultures in that area. So today we are joined by Dr. Kasey Keeler, assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin, about how life in the suburbs impacts indigenous people's connections to park and land. So welcome, Dr. Keeler. I feel like I kind of know you already from listening to the oral history projects. So for those that aren't familiar, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Kasey Keeler. I am an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin. Here at the University of Wisconsin, I hold a joint appointment in the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program and also in the School of Human Ecology. I'm also an enrolled tribal citizen of the Tuolumne Band of Miwok, which is a small tribal community in East Central California, and also direct descendant of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, which today is headquartered in Oklahoma after the Potawatomi's forced removal from the southern shores of Lake Michigan. But I also identify as a first-generation suburban Indian. I grew up in the Twin Cities. I grew up in Coon Rapids and lived there till I went to college. And upon my return, I moved back to the suburbs and most recently lived in Crystal, Minnesota, while I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. Today, I'm based in Madison, which, even though it is the capital of Wisconsin, feels like a very big suburb.
I could see that. This I connect with because I live in Crystal. So you grew up in the suburbs. You mentioned moving around a little bit, but how do you think living in the suburbs impacted your connection to your culture and your connection to the land?
Yeah, growing up in the Twin Cities, I didn't always think about what does it mean to be an American Indian person living in a suburb. But as an adult, it became something that I very much reflected on. But while I was a youth growing up in the Twin Cities, something that I did think a lot about was, why are my grandparents, why is my family in California and Oklahoma? Why are we in Minnesota? Knowing that's not a place that my family was from. I always knew I was Native. I was always involved in Indian education programming. I remember our family going to Minneapolis and participating in cultural events, the Indian Center, going to powwows, things like that. But I really recognized the suburb that I lived in, Coon Rapids, and most of the Twin Cities is a very white space. And I recognized that I was in Dakota homelands. I knew that the Ojibwe were there. But as I became older, I really began to reflect on what does it mean to be a Native person living in a predominantly white suburb and often feeling like you don't belong because of these societal pressures to be homeowners and landowners and reconciling indigenous dispossessions, the reservation system, and removal with these histories of suburbs.
I feel like when we talk about indigenous people, we often think of the city or reservations. We don't think about the suburbs. And I'm wondering why that is.
I would say that there's very much an urban Indian reservation binary. I think a lot of it has to do with the histories, the violent histories of settler colonialism across the United States. In Minnesota, we think about the Ojibwe communities being in the northern part of the state because that's where the reservations are located. And we think about the Dakota in the southern part of the state and the Dakota communities in the southern part of the state today. So I think these ideas about reservation Indians have to do with colonialism and the creation of the reservation system and where the reservations are located, and this assumption that most Native people live on reservation. In the 1950s, kind of coming out of World War II, was the Urban Indian and Relocation Program, which was a federal program that sought to move American Indian people off reservation and into designated urban areas across the country. These places were like Oklahoma City, Denver, the Bay Area in California, Dallas, Chicago. And Minneapolis although it was not an official relocation destination, it became a de facto destination because so many people from northern Minnesota and Wisconsin were coming to Minneapolis. And this program was funded by the federal government as a way to not only move people off reservation and get them to urban areas, but also to further assimilate American Indian people. This program, the relocation program, is closely entwined with the termination era of tribal nations, where the federal government was working to terminate tribal nations' status. That federally recognized status is a way to essentially cut money or save money for the federal government. So in the 1950s and 1960s, we see huge population growths of American Indians in urban areas across the country. But something that I think we fail to realize is that really the entirety of the continent is an indigenous place, and indigenous peoples have always been in the metropolitan area, suburbs, and the urban core, Minneapolis and St. Paul in the case of Minnesota.
Absolutely. So it sounds like indigenous people were forced onto reservations with treaty policies. And then in the 1950s, they were very strongly encouraged, maybe that's too relaxed of a word, but to move into specific urban areas, not even urban areas that they may want to, but specific ones. And so we don't think of them then as being in the suburbs. Is there any federal policies other than that you feel like had an impact on indigenous people moving to the suburbs or not being present in the suburbs? I feel like I read that there are more indigenous people in the suburbs around Minneapolis than there are in the urban area of Minneapolis.
Yes. So a lot of these movements of Native people has to do with policy, a federal policy. It also had a lot to do with World War II era employment. So even before the relocation and termination became official policies, Native peoples were leaving reservation communities in the 1930s because of the Great Depression in order to seek work. Native peoples in the 1940s were leaving the reservation to fill World War II era kind of employment needs as non-Native men enlisted in the armed forces. So we know that there was a lot of movement across geographies, on reservation, off reservation, urban areas, rural areas, as Native people were looking for work under these different economies. So I think that's part of it. But I think this also is part of a larger pattern of Native people in seasonal economies, right? It's like you move to where the resources are. So thinking about wage, labor, and employment isn't that far removed from seasonal rounds. And when Native people were moving to where the resources were, these resources just look different. In terms of federal policy of getting Native people off reservation, was there any to get them specifically into suburban areas? I would say no. The relocation program was in operation in the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s. And then in the 1990s, we saw the growth or the development of a program called the American Indian Home Loan Program that worked to provide home loans to enrolled tribal citizens. When the program first began, it was limited to use on reservation. And then in the early 2000s, it expanded to off-reservation use. So I would see in the early 2000s, there was maybe some federal Indian policy incentive to pursue home ownership off reservation, but not specifically in suburbs. But you're absolutely correct in that in looking at US Census data and where Native people are living over the last, 30, 40 years, we have seen the population shift in the metropolitan area of where Native people are living from the urban core. So from Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's been a population decline of Native people. At the same time, the Native population in the suburbs around the Twin Cities is growing. And today we know that across the United States, approximately 70% of Native people live off reservation, and the majority do live in a metropolitan environment.
I'm wondering, from your research and your own personal experience, are there unique challenges that a Native person might have in suburban Hennepin County or other suburbs when it comes to learning about their culture or connecting to nature?
Yeah, I think there are some challenges based on the proximity of where people are living to their tribal communities. For me at least, I couldn't drive up north for the weekend, right, to be with my tribal community, my reservation community. That wasn't an option. Looking at the demographic data, we do know that across the Twin Cities, there's a wide representation of tribal nations. So lots of Dakota, lots of Ojibwe people, but there are also indigenous peoples from other tribal nations across the United States. There's Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians. So there's some great diversity in the suburbs in terms of indigenous communities and who's representative there. But I would say that a lot of the Native people who live in the Twin Cities who are Dakota and Ojibwe, many have really strong connections to their tribal communities, their reservation communities, and many do commute on weekends to their tribal communities, which is really great to see. Again, we think about suburbs as these white places and often for Native people, sites of assimilation. So in many ways, it's encouraging to see Native people retain those tribal connections to their reservation communities and go back and forth, and where they might still have family. They're participating in powwows, participating in other cultural events. So I think proximity to the reservation is important to consider. But, we're also really lucky in the Twin Cities that there's Minneapolis, right, which is a large urban Indian community that has lots of cultural resources and programming available.
That sounds like a challenge in itself as well, though, because like if I wanted to practice my cultural heritage or my religion, I can take a 5-minute drive and find a church that relates to
everywhere.
me. Whereas you're talking about they're having to drive sometimes hours to get to the reservation community. So it's a drive that they can make that it sounds like you couldn't make as a kid, but it's still not something they can practice where they actually live.
Daily, you wouldn't be able to.
Right. I think increasingly there have been more grassroots efforts to bring some of the culture to specific pockets of the suburbs. But I would still say most of these cultural practices, ceremonies, things like that do take place on reservation.
Which, as you said, all of this land, all of suburban land is indigenous land. And so I imagine there were probably sacred places or special places where historically these traditions would have been done in what is now the suburbs.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Absolutely. As a result of settler colonialism, a lot of the sacred sites across the Twin Cities, particularly Dakota sacred sites, have either been destroyed or damaged due to settlement and development. And there's also sacred sites that continue to exist, but it's not something a lot of Dakota communities want to draw more attention to, right? Mm-hmm. Some of these sacred sites exist with city parks. And then it's always a negotiation between the Dakota community members who want to use the sacred sites for purposes of ceremony or community and coming together, and often having to navigate the bureaucracy to access those sites while retaining some level of privacy without having non-Native people come and cause some sort of harm.
Absolutely. When I'm in a church setting, I don't want somebody coming and filming it or taking photos of it or disrupting it.
Or asking for your pass and permit.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Like you feel like you have to have this permission and all this red tape to get through when it's... Yeah, the sacred site stuff was really eye-opening. If I know there's a tour, and I can't think of the name that offers it, but I got to do that this last year. And I cannot, everyone as a citizen of Minnesota should be required to go and experience something like this. And this led to an amazing part, bringing us back to kind of our area, and especially Crystal. I'm one that goes to Bassett Creek. And so you led a project and a podcast for Ha Ha Wakbanon. And I think this is very, after talking to DeAndre about, Paul Bunyan, here we go with another complete story. And I'm, again, so grateful because I never thought about Bassett Creek differently. And now I know who the person it was named after and the bigger picture of this. So I'm very grateful for that. But you had 15 Dakota, Ojibwe, and Ho-Chunk told their stories of growing up in this area. And again, can't stress it enough for people to listen to this. But was there anything, a little bit about that project for those that aren't familiar, but also curious, was there anything that you learned through that? I'm sure a lot, but that really stands out that you want to share with others?
Right. So we're talking now about the Wakpadan Bassett Creek Oral History Project. And this has been probably my favorite project, community engaged project to work on, both as a scholar, but also as a community member. And this is such a great project that's ongoing. I also want to point out. So this project began with the Valley Community Presbyterian Church, which is located in Golden Valley. And the Valley Community Presbyterian Church did a land acknowledgement statement, and they recognized during this process very early on that a land acknowledgement statement is not the end point. There must be a commitment, action, community engagement with Native peoples, responsibility, and like long-term planning, and also financial support. So I really think the Valley Community Presbyterian Church, their land acknowledgement statement and process is a model for how these things can be done well, because we also know that in recent years, many institutions, organizations, events offer land acknowledgements, but that's where it stops, right? They become empty words on a paper. People pat themselves on the back and they move on.
Yeah, like they're saying it to feel better and then just moving right by it.
Right. So what Valley Community Presbyterian Church did is that they had a task force that worked on the land acknowledgement statement. And once they felt good with that, they began thinking of what should we be doing now, recognizing that this is a process. This is not an endpoint. This is something that we must continue. So their task force was led by a woman named Crystal Boyd, and she's a member of the church. And she's super amazing. I actually have a call with her right after this podcast because this project is ongoing.
Tell her I say hi. Tell her Angela says hi. We go back to the Dragonfly days. She was one of our grant people too then, and she is so amazing.
So
cannot agree with you more on that one.
So Crystal really took the lead on doing grant writing and figuring out how do we get funding to support the program that we know needs to happen. So she worked and secured funding from the Minnesota Historical Society, and she found my dissertation from the University of Minnesota, which looks at suburbs as in historically Indigenous places and American Indians in the suburbs. And she contacted me and she's like, hey, I'm at this church. We're doing some oral histories coming out of a land acknowledgement process. Do you want to be involved? And I really jumped on the opportunity being based here in Madison. I miss the Twin Cities. That's where much of my research looks at Minnesota. And this is a project that would have been it has been a dream to be involved with because of my own experience and research interests. So I worked with Crystal. I did grant writing with her. We got additional funding from the University of Wisconsin. And we really came together to plan out what would an oral history project look like and what funding do we have with the funding that we have, what will it look like? How many people can we interview? What would compensation for participation look like? We talked about cultural advisors. So the project had a Dakota cultural advisor and a Ojibwe cultural advisor. And then we really worked on identifying Native people in Golden Valley and the Bassett Creek area that would potentially be involved in the project and doing a lot of community outreach. This was also during the COVID years. We would have liked to have done interviews in person. It was COVID. I had a newborn baby. So I ended up doing most of the interviews via Zoom, but it's been really great to see the project unfold over the last and how the program is evolving, which is so exciting. So the first leg of the project was 14 interviews. And there has continued to be a series of community engagement opportunities. I know Tanya Stewart, your next speaker, was not only a participant in the oral history projects, but she's also been involved in some of the community engagement activities that continue to happen. Crystal continues to write grants to support the project. So there's going to be another round of interviews. And Crystal and I continue to meet. We're meeting this afternoon to talk more about publishing, doing some more public-facing scholarship, academic-facing work. She has presented on this project. I've presented on this project. And it actually is the first oral history project of American Indians in the suburbs. So I'm really excited to see this project continue to expand and grow in really exciting ways.
It truly is amazing. And one thing I want to say about it is we've done a lot of podcast interviews over Zoom. And so I'm pretty good at like listening to a podcast going, oh yeah, no, they were doing it virtually. Oh no, they were in person. I really couldn't tell that you weren't in person. You all did. It was high quality. The stories really made me think about things in a deeper way. It's an amazing series.
It was very personal too, and just you could feel that in the story and connections, and that's hard to do in interviews, not in person.
Yeah.
So kudos to you all.
Thank you. And a lot of it is about the community building, meeting with each of the participants before the interview happened, sharing my own story. But there are absolutely times where it's emotional. The things that people share is so powerful to hear.
One thing I am always curious about, Three Rivers Park District parks are in suburban Hennepin County. We're suburban parks. And my job as an educator is to support anybody who wants to come out and find a connection to nature. That's really kind of what my job comes down to. So as you were talking to people, as you've had your own personal experiences, do you have any recommendations for a suburban park to provide support for connecting to nature for the Indigenous community?
A few minutes ago, I mentioned access, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big part of it. In every city, every park has different rules about access and permitting and who can use that space or reserve the space or if there's fees associated with it. So I think that's a good place for parks and park leaders, those who work at parks. When Three Rivers Park District is a different example than like a smaller park in Minneapolis, right? In terms of management and oversight. So I think where people are able to make sure that access for Indigenous peoples is smooth and easy and direct as it can be, and being respectful of the ways that Indigenous peoples want to engage with the land. It might not be a sacred site, right? It just might be that somebody needs access to outdoor space for something and they want some respect and privacy, and how can the parks help facilitate that? So I think in many ways it's about being a good ally and informing yourselves, right?
That's so good. This podcast will be definitely utilized in some of our work that we're still doing at the parks, because I think I think we assume a lot, right? Like we have research permits, we have volunteers. It's a very transactional thing. Mm-hmm. And realizing from our side that like you can't assume that. Like you have to build those relationships and it's going to look different. And you can't make those assumptions.
I think that's pretty spot on, is we can't make assumptions about how people want to engage with the land and what that looks like. And I think there's so many great resources in the Twin Cities for folks who want to learn more. But also part of that learning more process is when you are approaching a Native person or a scholar or a community member, you need to recognize that you're asking them for their time and their knowledge. And there needs to be some sort of compensation. It doesn't need to always be this capitalistic transaction where you're like, I'm going to pay you $20 an hour. It can be gift giving. It can be relationship building. I know something you all do for this podcast is service. So recognizing that you need to compensate people for their time and their knowledge when you are working to learn how to be a better ally.
That's a big thing to Brandon that I want to acknowledge, that he's been really good about developing our honorarium system, and that it isn't just about money. It is about meeting people face to face, whether that's getting a coffee and then offering that service part. That's very kudos to you, Brandon. It's a good example for, I hope, everyone else in the Park District follows and beyond.
Well, it's fun for me because I get to learn a lot. I do think too, though, like the service to me is the important part, but I also think if you can afford to compensate people monetarily as well, because you all are taking time off your jobs for us. And I know, Dr. Kasey, you just wanted the service portion, not the monetary portion, but I appreciate all the time and work you gave us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Not off the top of my head. I think you all are doing such a great service just by making these conversations accessible to the larger public. So thank you for all the good work that you are doing and for bringing the three of us together.
Well, thank you so much for trusting us with your story. I really appreciate the trust and the information and how it can allow me to continue to think about this and process how I want to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Next time, we are talking to one of the participants in the Ha Ha Wakpadon Bassett Creek Oral History Project, Tanya Stewart.